Good morning, Team Krulak community, and welcome back to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole on the Russia-Ukraine War. Major Ian Brown here, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center, and as always, we have Dr. Yuval Weber with us as our Russia subject matter expert to talk about the latest developments in the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I think we're just a week out from our previous episode, which we sort of acknowledged we'd probably be doing more often because tempo is sort of starting to increase on different parts of the battlefield. So Yuval, if you want to kind of maybe just start us off of between now and then, last time we talked, the counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region have been underway for maybe 2 to 3 days, and now it's been roughly a little bit more than a week. Where do we stand? What's sort of the current status in that particular region, and what are some of the things we've been seeing coming out of that in the last week?
So great, yeah. We're certainly in a much newsier part of this conflict. So since we last spoke, the front, so like the tempo of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, which had been sort of loudly proclaimed in Kherson in the south for a number of weeks ahead of time, the counteroffensive in Kharkiv was obviously the Ukrainians were able to maintain a large amount of operational surprise, even though when I started to look at a number of like Russian military bloggers on Telegram, they had been noting that the Ukrainians had been essentially creating a lot of operational reserves in the northeast and had been trying to communicate that to Russian leadership. And I think we'll talk about failures in Russian leadership, continual failures in Russian leadership in just a minute. But in effect, it went very fast. And as we were looking up how much territory has Ukraine basically reconquered, apparently it's a bit larger than Delaware. Next up is Connecticut. And as you were saying before, we're basically going up throughout New England. So there's a Revolutionary War reference in here somewhere. But what the Ukrainians have been able to do in the Northeast is, as they put it, deoccupy large numbers of settlements, huge amounts of land, and basically push the Russian front lines back quite a bit from where they started. And in effect, the Ukrainians have deoccupied or liberated or won back, in effect, everything that the Russians have conquered since April. So obviously this gets them closer to the pre-war borders, let's say of February 23rd, but also depending on what happens in Ukraine, in the south, they'll get closer and closer to the pre-2014 borders. And so that's something that obviously we'll see whether the Ukrainians have basically another wave to the counteroffensive. And obviously it's slowed down because these are like real people. They can't fight indefinitely. And so we'll see. There's been, obviously, Ukraine has done conscription since the beginning of the war. They have had, at this point, tens of thousands of people being training outside the country for the last 6 months. So perhaps might that be the operational reserve that relieves the troops in the front? Or might they open up a third battle group to attack the area in between Kherson in the south and Kharkiv in the northeast, go towards Melitopol and really try to collapse the Russian front altogether. What the Ukrainians have found as they've been fighting forward is all of the horrors of places like Bucha earlier in the conflict that were, temporarily held by the Russians in Izum, Balaklia, and all of these other towns. They're finding evidence of mass graves, peoples whose hands are tied behind their backs and shot through the back of the head. And this includes service members. So the Russians clearly took prisoners, executed them, and then threw them in holes in the ground. There's been obviously like photographic evidence that we're not going to share of numbers of civilians who died in the same way. So that's going to basically help shape the things that we've talked about over the course of this conflict. We'll talk about the Russian side of it in just a second, but one of the things that we've talked about over the course of this conflict is what's going to run out first: Western support for Ukraine, or basically Russia's ability to conduct this war in terms of the Russian economy. What the Ukrainians have showed basically over the past week is that the aid that they're getting has been properly used, has been used for the purpose that it was designed to do, which is to expel the occupying army from its land. Once we start to get the evidence of war crimes in addition to that, the diplomatic unity of basically the pro-Ukraine coalition is going to remain. And in fact, we'll see over time how much stronger it's going to be in terms of the weaponry that is going to be given to Ukraine. We've also seen over the past week evidence of command and control of partisan assassinations behind Russian front lines. Just over the past 24 hours, 5 judicial officials in Luhansk and Kherson have been assassinated. Just a couple of days ago, there was an assassination attempt on the rector, which is sort of like the president of the university, in Kherson as well. So it shows that not only are the Ukrainians basically fighting from the front, trying to push the Russians back, but that there's significant even command and control coordination of partisan activity behind Russian front lines. So that, from 2 directions should be corroding morale of Russian troops as well as the civilian occupation officials.
Yeah, so with I was actually looking up as you were talking because I saw it last night. I wanted to check myself, but the mass grave in Izum specifically, if once they count all the bodies, this may be the largest mass burial, mass execution since the Balkan Wars back in the mid 1990s, when there was a lot of that really horrible stuff going on, and I think as you said, this will not be the last. The more territory that gets liberated, the more of these we're going to find. So, and on top of that too, I think they've. I don't know if it was Izum or another town that was nearby, but I also recall seeing, they had some of the prisons or the police cells where Ukrainians have been held. There's blood splattered on all the walls. Somebody had carved a prayer into the wall before they were taken somewhere else. So it's
the I guess president or head, I'm not sure the exact title off the top of my head, but of the European Commission, which is like the bureaucratic arm of the European Union, Ursula von der Leyen, has said that she wants to see Putin, see his time inside a courtroom in The Hague at the International Criminal Court. I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Putin will be leaving or going to basically what the Russians call unfriendly countries for the rest of his life, however long that may be. I can't imagine him going to, France or Italy on vacation and getting served papers in order to make his way to the Netherlands. But ultimately, all of these are war crimes, and the awfulness of basically the Russian army's conduct is, the larger problem with what is this war for Russia. I mean, on the Ukrainian side, and this is the reason that this is like the national moment for modern Ukraine. Like the nationhood is coming together, and so every soldier knows whatever his or her duty is, driving these people out is the ultimate goal there. So everything within sort of like, what am I doing today? What are we doing next week? All has one clear goal. And this, we can start to sort of like try to figure out, the mobilization question that has come up inside Russia is, we'll talk about the particulars in a moment. But in essence, when you think about Russian society, they're getting 2 very different messages. One message is these are Ukrainian Nazis. These are the people who are like out to destroy the world, out to destroy Russian people, culture, language, etc. But the other message is this is not anything that you need to be worried about. Everything is under control. The special military operation is limited in size and scope. And so in that regard, you have basically the Russian troops who are told, you are the front lines defending Russia's existential right to survive, Russia's sovereignty. So why not commit like all the bestial things that you've ever wanted to do? Why not like execute prisoners? They're not humans in any case. But at the same time, the Russian people are being told everything is under control. And so, when we think about then mobilization, there's obviously the Russians need more people. I've seen various figures, but roughly speaking, friend of the Krulak Center, Rob Lee, has estimated that 85% of Russia's fighting capabilities are basically involved one way or another in this conflict. And we'll talk about the tail end consequence, or the second and third order effects of that elsewhere where Russia has interest. But if, let's say, 85% of Russia's fighting capability is doing this and things are not going well, the time to have done mobilization was 6 months ago, 9 months ago, years ago, to have more available for fighting right now. So if there is mobilization, obviously this would be bringing the war into Russian cities. This would be the acknowledgement that the war is a war, that the special military operation has failed. And we saw the first little bits of this when Gennady Zyuganov, who's the head of Russia's Communist Party, who doesn't play any meaningful political role, but he is a famous person. He's been in Russian politics for 30 years or so. When he said, this is a war and we need mobilization, this could have been a signal, to the Russian population, get ready. This could have been a signal from the military through Zyuganov to the Russian presidential administration. You need to do this. And it, obviously it helps, let's say, articulate the concerns of, what are now being called Russian military bloggers, the people who are basically at the front and reporting from the front, that in essence, their concerns are being acknowledged and articulated. But as the Russian press spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, it's good that people are taking an active role or an active interest in Russia's, political and military affairs. But he distinctly warned them to stay out of articulating policy. And so we see that because of the success of the counteroffensive, the Russian sort of presidential administration, the Russian state, for the first time in this conflict, doesn't have a clear counter narrative ready, because they've been able to articulate to two different audiences: Ukrainians are Nazis and bad people, don't worry about anything. And now these two things are coming together. So if they did mobilization, it would be recognition that the war is a war. It would be recognition that Russia's not doing well. And this would be humiliating for Putin. And that's the core thing that he can't abide by, because if he acknowledges one thing is going wrong, how many other things are going wrong? If they did mobilization, this would, as I was trying to hurriedly read Russian labor law before we got on, this would be devastating for the Russian economy, because for all the people who are then get sent to fight, their jobs and wages have to be preserved. So the Russian economy is already in bad shape as is, and basically all these employers would then need to find labor to replace the people who are then sent to war, but at the same time pay two different sets of people: the people actually working plus the people who are fighting. So what that would do to basically small, medium, large size enterprises could be devastating in its scale. Again, unclear how useful mobilization would be today. And we were just talking, Wagner military group is directly recruiting from inside prisons. And I just wanted to ask you, what is your view on the fighting capability of someone who's been inside prison and is choosing to go to the front lines over remaining in prison?
Well, there's a number of layers here. And one thing that occurred to me was, fighting capabilities aside, the kinds of people you're recruiting now to put on the front line means that the things that are already being found in Izium and presumably will be in other places that are liberated, that's just ramping up the potential, because, whatever sort of, boundaries of conscience, if you will, the Russian soldiers 6 months ago may have had, we've seen, those people were the ones who were in Izium, in Bucha, and these other places, right? That's as good as it's going to get. It's only going to go down if you're recruiting, the hardcore criminals who are in prison for, pretty good reasons, right? If you're a bad guy in Russia, that's probably times 2 or 3, what the hardcore criminal in the United States or a Western country is. In terms of the fighting abilities, I don't know the demographics of the Russian prison population. You probably have, there's probably, So listening, let me go back. Listening to that recruiting speech from the head of Wagner.
And can you describe that recruiting speech?
So, in a nutshell, and this we were talking about this before. Like, it's basically the Suicide Squad pitch, right? Like, you got 5 life sentences, right? But you come and fight for 6 months, and your time goes away. Like, if you served your time, and that's if you survive the 6 months, right? But if you're facing multiple life sentences, that's better odds that you have daylight at the end of that particular thing. On the flip side, he also specifically said, and the fact that like he said this out loud, I just couldn't wrap my head around. But it was like, if you join us, but then you refuse to fight, well, we're just going to execute you. And I don't want to diminish the seriousness of it, but it is literally like the Suicide Squad pitch. You fight, you come fight, you'll reduce your prison sentence. But if you join up and then back out later, those who've seen the movie, they have little bombs inside your head that go boom, and you don't get to back out, right? Your only way to back out is to win the fight, basically, or death. Heck of a recruiting speech. I mean, I just mind blowing. In terms of the quality, who knows, right? Like some of your that certainly provides motivation, right? If you know your only exit is to fight well and live, that maybe that makes you stand on the front line a little bit harder. Does that translate into any better fighting skill? Not necessarily. There may be some acquired survival skills just living in prison day to day in Russia that maybe that proves a little bit more useful than your average conscript or voluntold contract soldier. But I don't know. To me, like looking at that, like you're again, as we were maybe it was 2 or 3 episodes ago, like with I think it was the 3rd Armored Corps, right? Like,
Yeah.
Right now, you're just looking for bodies. You're looking for bodies to use their flesh and blood to plug holes. And it may be the best that they do for you is that for Ukrainian forces to kill those bodies slows them down enough that maybe it buys you a little bit more time to establish something. But just because you're a hardcore criminal doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be an effective soldier. Just because you have a proclivity for violence doesn't mean, it's very easy to do violence against the weak or the vulnerable, right? Against a victim on a dark alley. May not work against somebody who's fully armed, trained, equipped, has good survival instincts on the other side, and is ready to stand there and fight back. It's the difference between a bully and a professional. I don't
A
bully and
professional
professional.
soldier
Yeah.
Who has at least artillery support.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe it gets some more warm bodies, but what was interesting to me though, aside from the crazy nature of that speech, was some people were commenting that maybe that this seemed to be an effort to make the Wagner group more of a public face of the special military operation as opposed to strictly the Russian military. Is this maybe part of to your earlier point there about the chicken's coming home to roost, like things not going well as possible? If we make the Wagner group the face of it and then it goes badly still, we can blame the Wagner group and not the military or Putin?
I mean, ultimately, there's going to be a lot of blame to share because, just thinking about how much of a public role like Wagner is going to take in addition to, what the Russians call allied forces, to make it seem that this is, a, multinational coalition of Russia and Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, is that just when you were describing like this is just warm bodies to slow down the Ukrainian advance, like the Russians call this, like in English, there's a phrase cannon fodder. In Russian, the phrase is meat grinder. So just to give the sense of like when the Russians have these to use a euphemistic phrase, casualty intensive way of war, it just is striking to me that these individuals are there merely to slow down the advancing army. And like that's their role on this earth for the rest of their days. And and then sort of thinking about that, it's like if you have like Wagner, if you have all these, because the Russians are having difficulty like raising enough volunteers, is that none of these issues are going to solve any of the command problems, any of the leadership problems, any of the logistical problems. You're just putting people in there to die, but to die a little more effectively than perhaps others who have been trained a bit more. And so, in that regard, the more Wagner that you have, maybe it's good for like the news cycle and so forth, but ultimately, the responsibility for this is going to go to the military and the security services. Because once this war sort of like finds its conclusion, however like awful and bloody it's going to be, my one prediction for like what does Russian leadership look like after this is there's going to be a lot of brutal infighting as basically Putin starts the purges in order to make sure that responsibility doesn't rise to his particular level. And so Wagner is just going to be one part of that. They are the most dispensable of all elements of Russian fighting forces, and they will be dispensed.
Yeah, and to your point about the overall dynamics of the war too, whether or not they're slightly more effective war fighters, whether they can apply their violence more effectively than the random contract soldier. It was interesting because that video came out at the same time as other videos are coming out of these reunions in the liberated territory, right? And it's such a contrast in the dynamics of the war. Like on the you've got life sentence, you go to the front, and if you live, you get pardoned, and if you don't live, you don't live. We don't really care, right? On the flip side, you've got like sons liberating the villages of their parents, or parents liberating the villages of their children. I'm like, I don't care how deep you go into the prisons, like that dynamic is not going to change. And one of those dynamics is more sustainable, and as we talked about in terms of like the moral aspect of conflict, that's that noble vision that John Boyd talked about of pulling those people off the fence, getting them in your corner, getting you resources, getting you things to carry that on, versus, hey, we're throwing prisoners on the front lines, right? Like that dynamic is only going to go in a positive direction for one of those groups.
It's we can compare and contrast each element of what's happening on different sides of the front line. And as you put, I've seen some of these videos, and obviously most people don't want to be in the position of having to liberate their own hometown and like, meeting the townspeople who welcome them as, liberators, or literally as the video that we saw, and perhaps we can include a link to it. Um, this Ukrainian soldier, obviously, like, they were ready to film, like, met his mother. Like, he liberated his own family from the occupying forces. That's an emotional connection. That is a demonstration of like what is good in conflict. And obviously, when we're then thinking about morale, I'm sure every Ukrainian at this point has seen that video, and it's stunning. So you have people who are fighting for literally their homes and their families, and I saw one of these prisoners who was like agreeing to go, and his like basically his cellmate was like, "What's up? Like, why are you doing this?" And he's like, well, he mostly cursed, but he basically said something to the effect of, "Screw it, ought to be fun." And you're like, oh my God, like that guy, if that guy survives like any amount of time, he's going to do some awful things. And there is no one who's going to be proud of him. And then you think for the Russian soldiers who do come back, it's if they don't come back victorious, which it doesn't look like they are, when you then sort of contrast like what are the societal moments. On the Ukrainian side, this is their modern nationhood. On the Russian side, it is you failed in something minor. That's going to have some like really bad knock-on effects in Russian domestic society, basically for generations to come. Because this is going to be something, because this was already a problem like in the 1980s with the Afghanistan war. All these guys came back having not won. These guys are going to come back having not won and being embarrassed in the process. And like that's going to be pretty gnarly.
Yeah, and it's not, I mean, historically, not just in those Russian examples, but you could look back through a number of wars in the 20th century, a disgruntled soldiery that comes back not to victory parades, but to an impoverished, destitute country that's been, depopulated of the prime of its youth. and these, not only are they disgruntled, they haven't won, that's why they're disgruntled, but they've also seen and done horrible things in this conflict, and it didn't work out in the end. Not a solid basis for future domestic stability,
Yeah,
at all.
there are going to be a lot of angry dudes in every town, village, and city of Russia. And to me, like, and we can sort of speculate, on Russia's futures when this is all done. But sad and angry people who have done horrible things and no one thanked them for it. That's not good when you spread that across an entire country of 140 million people.
Yeah, it's not. And even to, as you mentioned, like the job preservation piece, right? Like on top of all the discontent, if you come back and the economy's in the tank and the job, maybe you were promised your job would be held when you left, but the economy simply can't sustain that. Now you're back. You're morally and mentally damaged. You might be physically damaged too, right? Coming back, you didn't win. You've seen and done horrible things, and you don't have a job. You're broke. Like not a good mix at all. Um, so while we're sort of talking about this contrast too, another aspect of the liberation of those territories was, I don't know if it was within 24 hours or within a shorter amount of hours, but right after Izium was liberated, you had the president of Ukraine just like walking there and talking to his soldiers who were already there, um, and kind of in striking contrast to the times that, well, we've never seen Putin on the front lines for starters. And when he's talking to his more senior commanders, they're always like, they're way down there, he's all the way back here,
Yeah.
and never the twain shall meet. So what is that sort of what's that contrast say right now? I mean, we've sort of seen it a little bit before, but it was really striking that within hours the you had the head of state of a country with, he had personal security, but the fact that they felt confident enough to send him there to the front, close to
Yeah.
the front lines, basically, was pretty striking.
And certainly, from basically the top on down, as you put it, basically the Ukrainian military and civilian administration, like presidential administration, felt it was safe enough that in effect that they were demonstrating that they were not excessively afraid of what the Russians might do, knowing that basically like the president of Ukraine is coming. They also demonstrated, and this is something that like friend of the pod, friend of Krulak Center, Mick Ryan, noted, and he writes very well about this conflict. What is the leadership contrast? And it showed that the president of Ukraine was willing to go to the front lines, put his personal safety at risk in the exact same way that the soldiers were doing. So not only did he get a sense for like how, the soldiers are doing in terms of like their morale, also like what's going on, but that those junior soldiers, those commanders, not just the people who see him, but everyone who hears about it understands that this guy is coming down and he is interested in making sure people's morale is up. And people take inspiration from that. And obviously, Putin, who generally does not interact with like normal humans anymore, the only people that he deals with is basically personal security, his ministers, and like other world leaders. And there was a strange experience a couple I guess about 2 weeks ago or so. At this point, he went to Kaliningrad, which is the Russian exclave that used to be Königsberg in the days of yore. And like the motorcade is like speeding along, and they basically just like stop randomly, and he just like he peeks his head like out of the limousine and just like yells at like the people who are nearby, "How are you doing? How is the governor treating you?" And like the people are like, "We're doing fine. Governor's okay." And he's like, "Okay, great job," and like gets back in the limousine and speeds off. And you then think like, is that his version of like interacting with like normal people? And we've seen over the course of like his interactions with like seemingly like normal people, is that the same normal people just change costumes, and he has his personal security pretend to be like iron workers, they pretend to be injured soldiers, they pretend to be like oil workers. They just like basically the same people show up in every single picture when he's photographed dealing with society at large. And then Zelensky is like putting himself near the front line in order to buck up the spirit of the junior soldiers. And like that basically is what you need to know about the rest of Russia, or the sort of like the contrast between Ukraine and Russia, and what is basically all the stuff that we've talked about of Russia's problems with command and control, Russia's problems of not being a learning organization. What is Putin actually learning? What is Zelensky learning? And those things are, when we talk about like Wagner and all those people, like the role of the Wagner private military company, and particularly those convicts, is just to slow down Ukrainian advance. The point of the junior soldiers is to actually liberate their country. That's essentially going to be the stuff that makes this war come to an end, ostensibly more on Ukraine's side than Russia's.
Yeah, the I think I'd missed that his or Putin's drive-by visit to Kaliningrad, but it is as you're describing it. I'm trying to remember if this was something I'd seen either on the news directly from North Korea, or maybe I saw it in the movie The Interview. I can't remember, but sort of the dynamic was the same. It's literally the motorcade stopping in a wave, and that's the interaction of the leadership of the dear leader, with his people. That's the level, and it's functionally the same level that Putin has with his own people. And I'm glad you brought up the learning organization, because the way you learn a lesson is you face it. Like you go and touch it and you interact with it, and that's what lets you make your adjustments and get a real sense of things. And if you're not there, you're not there, and that means you're only learning from what people are telling you. And as we've discussed at length in previous episodes, nobody's going to be the person that gives them the bad news.
And this is so I just like finished a book on like Russia's political economy, and one of like the great, we always hear about Potomkin villages, from one of the lovers slash ministers of Catherine the Great, Grigory Potomkin, who basically, when she was like, sailing down rivers, would have like the facades of buildings, constructed in order to demonstrate, oh, everything is going well. Look how much industry and, population and settlements we have. But that's been an issue going back to Tsarist times, but particularly Soviet times, and now current times, is one of the things that we've talked about at length about Russia not being a very good sort of a Russian military, but sort of Russian state in general, not being a good learning organization, is that no one wants to be the person who brings bad news, because that person then owns bad news. And so you get on the top, objectives are made, whether it's the agriculture or fighting or industrial production. The objectives are set and everyone basically does their best. Their best isn't good enough, but they report that they did their best and fulfilled the objectives nonetheless. And so what we've seen in this conflict is people reporting, in effect, that they've fulfilled all objectives, they haven't, and then a new assault is ordered based on the objectives that were fulfilled. And then you get, the platoon goes and, gets slaughtered, and then the survivors think, what am I doing the fighting for? And again, all of this is about being a learning organization and willing to take bad news. And the Russians simply have not demonstrated from the top on down that anyone wants to be the owner of bad news. We started here with talking about mobilization, but mobilization would mean that the Russian state is owning bad news, and they are going to move heaven and earth to avoid that exact outcome.
And to kind of rewind it just a few minutes ago as well, to the disgruntled soldiery coming back without victory, and the impact, it's not just a military problem in Russia as a non-learning organization. There are specific. Putin has crafted the country essentially to be a non-learning organization, to not have that bad news talked about. Everything else considered, what do you do when all those soldiers bring back that bad news? Whether it's in a few months or another year, whenever the conflict sort of reaches a stopping point, they're all bringing it back in mass. And what does that do in that dynamic of blah, 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 I don't want to hear it. Along with tanking economy and, loss of your youth and your generation. So that's just another ugly dynamic that'll be at play there.
It's quite clear what's going to happen is that when they come back and tell their experiences to their friends, family, neighbors, no one is going to want to hear one word of it because they will be despised for their failure. And being despised for your failure because you are the person whose very existence signifies bad news. And like that social consequence is going to be very destructive.
Also not a good ingredient for long-term domestic stability. So another thing we wanted to hit today, and this jumps off, you talking about how among the people Putin interacts with, it's just his security detail and other world leaders, his equals on the world stage. He recently had a meeting with a number of world leaders, including his fraternal friends over there in the People's Republic of China. Can you kind of like what was that meeting all about? What was it what was it intended to address, and what were some of the things we saw in there? Because there were some very interesting, again, going back to video contrasts of this kind of rewinding video contrast of 6 months to Putin's pastime to how he interacted with those leaders now. What are some of the things that came out of that?
I think that the trip to meet with the other heads of Shanghai Cooperation Organization leaders could best be described as a Eurasian Veep episode. So the scene setter is in effect all the frozen conflicts that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly Nagorno-Karabakh and in Central Asia between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. Those are all warming up because the participants, but particularly like the leader of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, basically is not really concerned about what Russia is going to do. They view Russia as so occupied and so incapable of dealing with multiple crises at once that this is the time to basically attack Armenia proper. Because in particular with like those two situations where fighting has basically recommenced both in Nagorno-Karabakh and between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, is the Russian peacekeepers who would ordinarily be there in order to keep these warring parties apart are in Ukraine. Like there are, and just like to put a pin on this, the Russian peacekeepers who should be in Nagorno-Karabakh keeping Armenia and Azerbaijan apart, according to like, international obligations, so forth, they're fighting in Ukraine. The peacekeepers who should be in Tajikistan, basically, defending Central Asia from Afghanistan and maintaining regional stability, are in Ukraine. There are just two other quick examples. There have been evidence of killed in action and wounded in action and obviously taken prisoner, basically sailors from the Baltic Sea Fleet who were given like a week of training in a tank. And we also have seen the patches of the units that are assigned to Sakhalin Island, basically defending the Kurils from Japan, are also in the fight. So we're talking about that. But Putin goes in, basically everyone knows that he's unable to maintain any discipline or control amongst his, his friends, his partners, his allies, his client states. So everyone is clowning on him from the get-go. He is the person who has made every world leader wait for him over his 20 plus years in power. In this meeting, or in this series of meetings, the president of Kyrgyzstan made him wait. And watching the video is watching a man's heart break in real time. It's clear none of the casualties of his citizens bother him in the slightest, but being humiliated on camera, that got him. Like that actually got under his skin so successfully that if at a certain point Russia's just going to bomb Kyrgyzstan just to like let that happen. And then his meeting with Xi Jinping, which reflected one of the things that we talked about over like the past 6 months, is that the Russia-China relationship is lopsided in China's favor. And this was the meeting that signified it. It revealed the lack of Russian capabilities, the decline in Russian prestige, and the humiliation personally of Putin, because in basically the readouts and in the comments that they've made, Putin said, we basically, just summarizing, we acknowledge your, questions and concerns about this situation, your balanced view, and we take those very, very seriously. He also then signed on to all of China's foreign policy interests, abroad generally, Taiwan specifically. Xi, for his part, basically said nothing. We acknowledge that we appreciate your support. And what the meeting did was just signify how far Russia had fallen compared to China. And for Xi Jinping, who's basically been doing Mao cosplay for the last couple of years, the fact that he can clown on Russia in real time basically is the Mao Stalin, Mao Khrushchev comparison that he's probably been looking for the last couple of years. And ahead of this, just also to mention, she also issued a statement in support of Kazakhstan's territorial integrity. And Kazakhstan, for its part, is renaming its capital back to Astana from Nur Sultan, and said that it was not going to do anything for the Cooperation Security Treaty Organization, CSTO, efforts in basically bringing peace back to, or peacekeeping to Armenia, Azerbaijan, in Nagorno-Karabakh. So in every aspect of this, whatever China's domestic issues on like zero COVID and all those difficulties, whatever they're going to do or not with Taiwan, they are certainly going to take advantage as ruthlessly as possible the decline of Russian capabilities and influence in Central Asia and elsewhere. And that is Putin as a strategic genius.
To kind of not to dwell on it too long, but maybe if you could in a couple minutes, what are some areas or regions in Central Asia where we might start to see China pushing its position a little bit more aggressively now that this dynamic has been pretty firmly established?
So the big issues, let's start with Kazakhstan, because that's the biggest country there. So Kazakhstan, going back to the days of Nursultan Nazarbayev, who had, before leaving power, had been in charge of Kazakhstan for like more than 30 years, like since the last days of the Soviet Union, or last years of the Soviet Union. So when Kasim Tokayev, when he is basically taking these steps that seem to be anti-Russia and pro-China, one of the things that Nazarbayev, the previous leader, did that basically defined modern Kazakhstan is that Kazakhstan needs to balance between the United States, China, and Russia, because the rest of the world is very wealthy, but Kazakhstan can't change its geography. It can't change the fact that it has a sizable Russian minority. But, China is much more economically active. The United States is a very powerful country. So what the Kazakhs call this is multi-vector diplomacy, keeping everyone's basically balanced. All of these things that Tokayev is doing that seem anti-Russia is basically ensuring that Nazarbayev, the previous leader, who basically his forces were the ones that tried to do ostensibly a coup d'etat, seizure of the state in January of this year, that Nazarbayev and his people are kept as far away from power as possible. So in this sense, this is what China is taking advantage of. Because of the internal political dynamics of Kazakhstan, Russia is not popular. Tokayev is keeping its distance from Putin and basically taking all the opportunities that China has to offer. We've also seen that Tokayev is basically advertising his desire to export as much oil and gas as possible to the larger world, which is one of the United States' foreign policy objectives in order to maintain, in order to mitigate all the effects of like Russia cutting off oil and gas basically to the Western world. So we can see that Tokayev's version of multi-vector diplomacy is keeping Russia as far away as possible and bringing China and the United States in. That's what we're seeing in terms of the regional dynamics with Kazakhstan. With Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, they have a lot of borders that are the result of basically Stalin and Stalin era, making sure that if there is no strong central power, that these people would be fighting each other. Because ethnicities, like nationalities, do not line up with national borders. And so what we can see is the removal of Russia as a relevant political and security provider in this region. You have the Kyrgyz president, who's basically trying to make his name as a nationalist leader, basically getting the Kyrgyz Republic involved in a lot of disputes with Tajikistan. And Tajikistan, for its part, recognized that Russia's not going to come in. They're far more prepared for basically these sorts of border skirmishes. And so they're just shooting at each other. And the Tajiks, for their part, are now shelling into the Kyrgyz Republic. And so we can start to see that if Russia goes, a lot of these issues, which have been basically frozen in a certain sense, but certainly warming up underneath for decades, are basically going to get revealed. And the Tajiks, for their part, over the past couple of years, they've invited, China through Belt and Road Initiative to invest much more heavily in Tajikistan. There is a Chinese, it's not called a military base, but it's a military base in all but names. They call it the armed, border guards, armed police, basically protecting Belt and Road Initiative. But the Tajiks have basically put their investment, they basically put their bet on China and have invited China in. So as Russia leaves, China is going to have all these various opportunities in Central Asia because they're there. And Russia will be less and less. And that's basically the dynamic as we see Russia going, or as China goes from east to west. The first three countries on those borders are Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz Republic, and Tajikistan. And that's where China's putting its efforts in.
Yeah, that is a future that looks a lot more tumultuous, now than it did maybe a few months ago. And interesting, as describing the frozen conflicts coming unfrozen, seems kind of reminiscent of when the Soviet Union itself collapsed. You had a lot of frozen ethnic conflicts that flared up because you didn't have the USSR, to sort of clamp down with the iron fist anymore. Maybe now we're seeing. I don't know how far back some of these things go, but these are maybe older Russian imperial frozen conflicts, going back centuries that we may start seeing going hotter, as you mentioned. So we've been going for a good while now, but I think maybe we need to make this like a capstone to each of our episodes from now on. Is because we ended last week talking about Russian media and our friend on Russian state TV who looked like he'd had kind of a little bit worse for wear encounter with a Russian pop star. So I've seen a number of different translated videos this week coming out of the Russian TV. What's one that you saw this week that kind of struck you as noteworthy?
What struck me, so there are two. One is basically sort of like quasi liberal member of the elite. Like no one on TV is like fundamentally an opposition. Like no one from the actual opposition is allowed on Russian state TV. So like that's one. But they bring on these liberals from the 1990s in order to be like straw men who get humiliated and just like laughed at on TV. And we had basically like one little tiny crack of a person who clearly does not support this war and basically said this war is not going well, and he used the war. And one of the other guests, who's the head of one of these sort of like pretend opposition parties, basically went with like a pre-prepared speech on how wonderful the special military operation is going. And the thing that struck me wasn't just like the content of this, like, technically speaking, a rival to Vladimir Putin, but basically someone who could not be more loyal, versus a person who is also part of the system but had just like a different message, is that they both knew what was going on, but they didn't coordinate how they were going to like basically interact. And it just seemed that it revealed how stage managed all of these shows are, which obviously TV you have to stage manage so you don't have people like going off on tangents, like perhaps like we do, but that they weren't inhabiting the same universe. That to me, that was like a tiny little crack. It's not going to change anything, but it's the seed of doubt. And the other thing that was, I think, much more interesting was they had one of these Russian military bloggers who runs one of these popular Telegram channels, or Telegram sort of like microblogging sites. Is the guy basically, the question was like, how's everything at the front? And he started to answer, man, we're going to hit, this is bad, like going through the bad news. And you could just see like in real time, he realized like what he was saying. And then like in the middle of a sentence, just stopped himself and said, but we're fulfilling all of our objectives. And you could just see he was like, oh shoot, I'm actually like going off script and I need to actually save myself. And that to me, like when we talked earlier about the Kremlin's messaging, like they are really good at messaging, for the domestic population. And being really good at messaging means that you have one clearly understandable story. They've been trying to get two very different stories for very different populations. One population who wants the blood and guts, and another part of the much larger part of the population who does not want to be bothered whatsoever. And that, over the past week, has shown, the counteroffensive and its successes have shown that the Kremlin simply doesn't have a clear idea of where they want the messaging to go, to double down on one thing or the other. And so that's how you get basically these cracks in the armor.
Interesting. As you described that with that Russian military blogger, it reminded me of, I think it was 2 episodes ago maybe, but talking about that, like the only way a society that's been structured the way that Putin has done it is by, and I don't want to we haven't used the term Orwellian yet, I think, on this podcast. So maybe we'll make this the first one, but it is overused a lot in sort of our modern political discourse. But the notion, the Orwellian notion of true doublethink, where you can successfully have two utterly contrasting thoughts in your head and it doesn't drive you insane. It takes a very strong top down effort to make that work. And it partly it works because you can train people like the Russian blogger, like they do it for themselves. Like they'll tamp down on the competing thing because they've developed that habit pattern. But if you kind of don't have the iron fist structure to really continue to hold those two competing things together, as you said, cracks. And cracks are not good for any structure, especially if it's an inherently sort of fragile structure, which most authoritarian regimes are fragile. They all depend on the ability of the leader to have that legitimacy. Cracks undermine it and break it. So it's interesting because seeing doublethink in real time is always it's not always captured, and to me, sort of this is kind of more like a little hobby horse of mine because I've read post-apocalyptic literature for years and years and years, but seeing real doublethink in real time is striking. All right, Yuval, we've been going for a good while now, but
Yeah.
We expect that we're going to have to kind of up the tempo as we mentioned here in the weeks to come. So, as always, thank you for your time, and to our audience, thanks for tuning in and listening. We will have more coming out at a rapid tempo, as I said, but also if you're following us on our various channels, we have a couple of other broadcasts that'll be coming out about the same time, hopefully, that I get this one posted. So we'll have a lot of new things to talk about for you here, not just the Russia-Ukraine war, although it still will remain a focus effort for us here for the foreseeable future.